Writing an equation and graphing the relationship represented by the table. The table shows the number of minutes Carla reads every day. Write an equation for the relationship shown in the table, then graph the relationship. Okay, so we have our table here, days and minutes. The days obviously represent all the days that Carla's reading and how many minutes altogether total for that amount of days she has read. So to create the equation from this, we really want to kind of just look at the first terms here. The first term in the days row and the first term in the minutes row, and kind of analyze the relationship between those two numbers. It's pretty easy when they give you the unit rate of the relationship. And right then and there, you could pretty much see that, okay, knowing at the 6th grade level, they're only going to ask you at this point a one-step equation. So what I mean is your equation is only going to involve one operation, such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division only. Usually when you get to 7th and 8th grade, that's when they ask you two-step equations or, more challenging equations that you should gather from your table. But in this case, we can see right here between these two that either one is being added, 25 is being added to 1, or 25 is being multiplied to 1. And as we look further into the table and we look at the next term, we can see that the second option was the best, because if you multiply 3 by 25, you'll get 75, and so on and so forth. This pattern was pretty easy to see. So how are we going to write it in an equation? Well, first you want to identify what the independent variable is and the dependent variable. And as we have discussed before, y is usually the dependent variable. So that's going to be the number of minutes. And days is the independent variable, and that's the x. Okay? So when you write it in the equation, and here we're going to change the x to the d and the m to the y. When you write the equation, you know the dependent variable stands alone on the other side of the equation. And since we know that it is d being multiplied by 25, I'm just going to put 25d equals m. D is the independent variable, and that is on the main part of the equation. So our equation is 25d equals m. Okay? So now, how are we going to graph this relationship? So here we go over to the graph, and we have to label the graph correctly before we start labeling, or before we start plotting down the ordered pairs or the corresponding terms of the relationship in the table. And how we label the graph is, well, first thing you want to do is locate the origin, and that's always the easy one right there in the corner. You want to put that 0 there. That's usually always the origin. And we know that the horizontal axis is usually represented by x, so we really should always label the x, which in this case is going to be the days, so we're going to label the days down here. And the vertical axis is always the y. So you want to make sure that you always label the x and the y and the origin. It's the very first thing you probably should do. Most importantly, that we do need to give each relationship or each graph a title. So in this case, you could pretty much find any variation of how you want to title this. You could say Carla's reading minutes. I don't know, something. Probably could get a lot more creative than I just did, but just to speed things up, we're going to go with it. Okay, and we also need to title our horizontal axis and our vertical axis. So like we said before, our horizontal axis is going to be represented by x, which is, as we know, the days. So you want to give that title too. You have to title it. You have to make sure that you do give the title. If you don't, it's not a correct graph. Okay, so now we want to look at the vertical axis, and that's the minutes that caller reads. And that's represented by m. That's if you want to label your numbers with the m's and the d's. Okay, so like I said, it's important with the labels on the side of the x and the y axis. Otherwise, you won't understand what you're reading on this graph, and you're not going to understand where the information is coming from or how the corresponding terms have a certain relationship. So now, probably the most difficult part of creating the graph is labeling the intervals of the axes. Let's do the easy one first, which is usually the x. The x is usually easy. I mean, don't quote me on that, probably. Sometimes, as you get into 7th, 8th grade, probably get more difficult, but for the most part in 6th grade, the x-axis is usually the easy, most basic numbers. And in this case it is. We can just label them by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'll just keep going until I get to the end, even though I don't need 9. And as you notice, I did, sorry, I'm going to erase that. I did label some numbers that are not on the table. It's not on the actual data table, but I have to make sure that I have an even amount of numbers. The intervals are divided evenly. I cannot skip and go 1, 3, 5. I mean, I can if I wanted to. I could skip count by the odd numbers, as long as I kept it that way. But being that it's fairly small numbers here, you probably should just label it straightforward, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just for the purposes of the question I'm going to ask later on, I am going to ask you some questions about 2 and 4 and 6, and sometimes you could get asked about any numbers in between. Just keep it basic and simple and just label it 1 through 9. For the minutes, this is where you only have so many lines here on the y-axis, so you can't label them 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way up to 175. You know that's not going to work. So you do have to skip count your intervals here on the vertical axis. So probably the best thing to do here is 25. Skip count them by 25. You don't have to. Probably could skip count them depending on how many lines you have here. You could skip count them by 10s or even 5s, or I don't know, even 50s, but then you'd have to watch how you label your points. You wouldn't be wrong if you did, but probably to get closer and more of an accurate relationship, ordered pair shown on this graph, probably want to just keep it with the unit rate and then go from there. So we're going to go 50 on the next one, 75, 100, and we've got 125, 150, 175, and you will have to label this all on your own, so you want to make sure that you do keep it as simple as possible, and definitely have to keep it even. It's not correct if you don't have even intervals. I couldn't make this 25 and then make this 30 and then make this 75. That just doesn't make sense in a normal number line, and the graph would be incorrect. Okay, so now I want to take my ordered pairs here, and we know that 1 is the x and y is the 25, and sometimes people just like to write down those ordered pairs before they go ahead and plot them down to keep themselves organized, and some people just kind of see it right away from the table, and you could do it that way, and so on and so forth. You understand where this is going. So, you know what, let me pick a different color. Let's do purple. And let's plot these ordered pairs. Okay, so we've got a 1, 20, and comma 25, 3, comma 75, 5, comma 125, and 7, comma 175. Okay, good. So now this kind of shows a relationship that's happening here between the days and the minutes that caller reads every day. And if I was to draw a line, it would have to be a straight line using your ruler, which obviously I can't do on this computer. You can see that obviously the corresponding terms to each other cause a relationship that increases as you move along the horizontal axis. So if I was to ask you, even though it's not graphed and even though it's not in the table, how many minutes does she read in 2 days, you can base more information just from the graph alone. And even though this was not an ordered pair, we can tell that information from the graph that we just created. So you say to yourself, oh, great, in 2 days she read 50 minutes. You could tell that right away. And so on and so forth. You could do that with 4, you could do that with 6. What if I was to ask you about 9? Now you could either continue the graph here with 9 on top, And obviously just apply it to our equation, multiply it by 25 and get it that way. Or if you just had to base your information strictly off of 9, you can tell from this graph, say you didn't feel like doing the multiplication, you can tell right away, oh, okay, so she reads 225 minutes in 9 days. Okay, and that's how you graph a relationship represented by the table.